Episode 33, Social Credit and Debt. We are often told that debt can be avoided, and that if individuals, businesses, or governments find themselves wallowing in debt, it must be their own fault. But what if this isn't exactly true? According to the social credit analysis of Major C.H. Douglas, not to be confused with Chinese social credit, the overall level of societal debt must continually rise if we are to avoid economic depression and collapse. Oftentimes, the choice to take on additional debt is thus made under extreme duress. This is because the only way we can deliver sufficient consumer buying power so as to achieve an equilibrium with the flow of final prices is to induce governments, businesses, or consumers to continually borrow more money into existence in the form of bank credit from the banking system. But there is a big problem with this method of dealing with the price-income gap. You cannot borrow yourself out of debt. If, in each economic period, you require more debt money in order to pay off some of the production debts that are coming forward in final prices, you are merely exchanging one debt for another, instead of finally liquidating the production debt. In fact, the attempt to borrow yourself out of debt actually makes it even harder to meet debt claims in the future. Since consumer income is the only type of money that can finally liquidate, i.e. eliminate, production debts and indeed all other debts, introducing additional debt into the system to make up for the underlying deficiency of consumer incomes only puts more demands on those incomes in terms of debt servicing requirements. In response, people demand wage and salary increases in order to maintain the standard of living. These increases in labor costs necessitate larger production loans and eventually filter through as increased prices, necessitating even more debt money to compensate for an increased gap, and thereby generating a positive feedback loop. The end result of this inflationary process is an increasing mountain of debt, which is, in the aggregate, unrepayable. The total societal debt in most countries at any given point in time is now so great, both in terms of debt owed to the banking system and derivative forms of debt, that the amounts owed exceed, by several times, the entire size of the money supply, and that disparity is constantly increasing. From a social credit point of view, the excess of debt over money is a partial mirror or imperfect record in time of the recurring excess of prices over incomes in each productive cycle. The one imbalance leads directly to the other. On the basis of that compensatory mountain of debt, much taxation, interest, and service charges are levied in perpetuity. It's a colossal burden for us all, while constituting a cash cow for the banking system because of its existing monopoly on credit creation. The underlying deficiency in consumer incomes and the subsequent need that we have for more and more debt money to make up the shortfall thus puts us, both as individuals and as a collective, in the position of debt slavery. Since we can never liquidate debt without contracting more debt, control over policy also falls to the debt merchants. The banking system, that is to say the commercial banks in conjunction with the central bank, gets to decide if and when, to what extent and under which conditions, the additional debt money will be created and issued to help buoy up the flow of consumer buying power. This bestows on the owners of the banking system tremendous economic, political, social and cultural power. By contrast, the Douglas social credit alternative, by issuing a sufficient flow of compensatory consumer credits, debt-free, in conjunction with the regular flow of incomes to achieve equilibrium, allows us to finally liquidate the flow of prices associated with final production. This provides us with the ability to redeem our production debts, whether owed to the banking system or to the last firm in the chain of production, in full, once and for all, with no debt residue being left over. For when debt meets debt-free income, the two cancel each other out of existence. Social credit thereby breaks the monopoly of credit, restrains the growth of debt, and enfranchises all of us as shareholders in our societies and in our economic and financial systems. It took Western civilization many thousands of years to eliminate chattel slavery. Hopefully, it will not take us nearly so long to eliminate debt slavery. Douglas social credit shows us how this most necessary liberation can be achieved. Episode 31, Part 3, The Implications of the A+B Theorem. What is true of one productive agency is true of all others, so long as they are not headed for bankruptcy. The A+B theorem can therefore be generalized as follows. The total flow of prices being built up in the productive system as a whole must necessarily exceed the total flow of consumer incomes that are being distributed by it. Furthermore, since we operate in a capital-intensive economy, the all-important macroeconomic implication of the A+B theorem is that even when the economy as a whole is being maintained in a steady state of self-repeating motion, it is impossible to attain an equilibrium between the rate of final prices and the rate of income distribution. Instead, the rate of final price generation will also necessarily exceed the rate of income distribution. Say's law does not hold. The imbalance in flows can only be overcome from within the existing system in one of two ways. We can try to add to the flow of consumer purchasing power relative to the flow of final prices by further increasing production, especially capital production, which will intensify the problem at a later stage of production unless it is exported, and or by getting consumers to borrow more money into existence from the banking system to supplement their incomes, which will also intensify the deficiency of consumer purchasing power at a later time because those debts have to be serviced out of future incomes. Or we can, through the mechanism of forced sales and bankruptcies, rely on productive organizations, businesses and governments to subsidize the consumer by selling their goods and services at a loss. Since the latter option involves economic slowdown, financial crises, mass unemployment, and social instability, we usually opt for ways to increase the flow of consumer buying power instead. Under the existing system, this means increased governmental, business, and consumer debt, with all the economic, social, political, cultural, and environmental problems that come with that forever increasing debt. Let it be stressed, however, that even when we manage to compensate for the gap in this way, it still remains true that the rate of total price generation exceeds the rate of total income distribution. But what if the needed increase in the flow of consumer buying power could be delivered by some other means that is more efficient, effective, fair, and, above all, free of debt? Consider the Douglas social credit response to the problem disclosed by the A+B theorem. Let us imagine, for the sake of simplifying the overall picture, that all production at the retail stage is being financed on revolving lines of bank credit. We can then regard the remunerative prices that businesses are charging in order to remain in operation very largely as debts that are owing to the banking system. Now, over and against those debts that are coming forward to be liquidated in every new productive cycle, the A+B theorem has shown that in every modern economy, even when production is being maintained in a steady state of self-repeating motion, insufficient consumer income is being liberated. A portion of the debts generated in production have not been provided for in terms of corresponding income, and therefore cannot be liquidated. The Douglas social credit solution to this imbalance is to monetize the deficiency by creating just enough new credit, free of any additional debt, to balance the surplus production debts and to distribute these compensatory consumer credits to consumers directly, through the national dividend, or indirectly through the national discount. This would be effected in lieu of all the contemporary methods of filling the gap. Once this newly created credit is spent and received by retailers, they will use it in conjunction with the normal flow of incomes from all sources to pay down their production debts, and both the flow of compensatory consumer credit plus incomes and the flow of corresponding production debts will cancel each other out of existence, since the repayment of every bank loan destroys the equivalent in bank credit. A self-liquidating financial equilibrium between the flow of final prices and the flow of consumer buying power will finally be attained. Episode 32. Are the causes for the lack of consumer buying power? We are sometimes told that the claim that there is an underlying deficiency of consumer buying power in the economy stands or falls on the truth of the A+B theorem. But what if this isn't true? According to the social credit analysis of Major C.H. Douglas, not to be confused with Chinese social credit, there are many other things that can provoke a lack of consumer buying power. In his book, The New and the Old Economics, Douglas outlined 4 major causes of deficiency beyond the A+B factor. Some of these can intensify the effects of the A+B phenomenon, while others act independently of it. First off, there is profit. Businesses charge more than their costs in order to make money. That is the incentive for going into business in the first place. There is nothing wrong with profit-making in and of itself, and Douglas social credit is very much in favor of free enterprise. However, if businesses are demanding more from consumers via profit margins than they return to the consuming public by way of dividends, this will cause a gap. Secondly, there is the phenomenon of saving. People save money under the current system, if they can, because of all the artificial financial pressures to which they are subject. But if the rate of new savings exceeds the rate at which old savings are being re-injected as consumer spending into the economy, there will, once again, be a gap. Thirdly, savings can be reinvested once or indeed multiple times, and this generates a gap between prices and incomes each time investment takes place. Let's say a man saves 20% of his income for several months and eventually uses his savings to set up a small business. If he spends this nest egg employing some people in his business, the money he removed from the economy's pool of consumer incomes is thereby restored to the economy via the wages of the employees, and the goods that would, ex hypothesi, have gone unsold could now be sold. However, the money he spent on the new business has created a new cost which will have to be recovered. The only problem is that there is no new money made available with which those costs could be met. The original investment money, now transformed into consumer incomes, is cancelled when the previously unsold goods are purchased by the employees. If, instead of spending their incomes on consumer goods and services, the employees in our example decide to reinvest their earnings in another business or in expanding their employers, yet another cost will be created with no additional consumer purchasing power, and so on, every time the money is reinvested. Finally, a deficiency of consumer buying power can emerge if the banking system adopts a policy of deflation, i.e., if the rate at which new loans are being extended lags behind the rate at which old loans are being paid off. This is what occurs during a credit squeeze. By providing sufficient debt-free consumer credits to make up for any deficiency in consumer purchasing power, regardless of cause, the social credit proposals stabilize the financial and economic systems. Episode 35, The Financial Mechanism of Control, Part 1. In the preceding episode, we have seen how, under the existing financial system, the banks pursue an anti-social, dysfunctional policy for private gain. This policy presupposes an elaborate mechanism of control that may be explored via the following analogy. Let us imagine a man supplied with carrots and sticks, sitting on top of a triangular saddle on the back of an elephant. The elephant represents the real economy, while the man sitting on top symbolizes the banking system. In this episode, we will limit ourselves to an examination of the first plank, which constitutes one side of the saddle in our analogy. The rest of the mechanism will be analyzed in episode 36. First, a quick recap. According to the social credit analysis, the economy has two basic components, what Douglas termed the financial credit and the real credit. Financial credit refers to the ability to deliver money as, when, and where required. The real credit, by contrast, is the ability to deliver goods and services as, when, and where required. These two elements can be related in one of two distinct ways, depending on whether the financial system which administers the financial credit is an honest or a dishonest system. An honest financial system would operate like a properly functioning thermometer, as a neutral but reliable instrument. When, at the dawn of spring, it is 10 degrees Celsius outside, a thermometer that registers that temperature as 10 degrees is providing an accurate reading as a reliable instrument. Decisions made on the basis of that information will be appropriate decisions. If the thermometer read 30 degrees Celsius, it would be overestimating the temperature in terms of warmth. If it were to read minus 10 degrees Celsius, it would be underestimating the temperature. In either case, the thermometer would not be providing an accurate reading, and it would be useless as an instrument. Any decisions made on the basis of this sort of incorrect information would be misguided and productive of dysfunction. Something similar holds with respect to our financial system. On the level of production, whenever there is a legitimate need on the one hand, and the means, i.e., raw materials, labor, technology, etc., to produce the goods and services to meet those needs on the other, an honest financial system would automatically supply sufficient credit to catalyze that production. The current system, by contrast, only provides enough credit to catalyze some of that possible production, and so many legitimate needs for shelter, food, healthcare, etc. can and do go unmet. On the level of consumption, whenever a given flow of goods and services with remunerative prices attached is coming onto the market, an honest financial system would automatically ensure that sufficient credit in the form of income to purchase that production in full is supplied to consumers. For every dollar coming forward in price, a dollar in income would be going forward to meet it. The current system, by contrast, only automatically supplies sufficient income to purchase some of this production. It systematically underestimates, in income terms, the value of the production that is being delivered at remunerative pricing. The power to consume is not automatically equated to the power to produce. Thus, we see that there is an artificial scarcity of credit that is built right into the fabric of the current financial system. Of course, the scarcity in question does not prevent the financial system from sometimes issuing too much additional credit to compensate, thus provoking demand pull inflation. But that is another issue. The initial underlying scarcity of credit that is embedded in the system is the basis for the financial mechanism of control. It constitutes the first plank in the financial saddle because when money is artificially scarce, it acquires an importance and a power that it wouldn't otherwise possess. In terms of this relationship between the financial credit and the real credit, the artificial scarcity of money makes money the limiting factor. And since it is the limiting factor in the relationship, it also becomes the determining factor. Money determines if something will or will not be done, will or will not be obtained, not the real facts concerning our ability to produce and consume. This makes money, or the lack of it, more important than real people, their desire to consume goods and services, and the real capacity to meet those needs. The artificial scarcity thus subordinates the real credit of a society to its financial credit, which is an inversion of the due or proper relationship that should obtain between the two. We are forced to interact with the real world through this distorting lens because the artificial scarcity of credit and the consequent limitations which it imposes on our economic activities provide the banking system with the all-important leverage it needs in order to impose its self-serving policy. This animated series was sponsored by the Clifford Hugh Douglas Institute for the Study and the Promotion of Social Credit.